In this flight, I want to give you a sense of the history of Napa Valley and the history of Napa Valley in its wines. I think this is an extremely important way to look at the valley and think about how the wines are being made and why they're being made. And I think it's very important to understanding how the valley has come to be the way that it is today. Now, I would say that this may not be the most popular way to look at Napa Valley. Indeed, I think one of the things that Napa Valley can do is actually sort of sanitize your previous reputation, if you will. Meaning that if you have $1 billion, you can now go and invest it in Napa Valley, and you can make extraordinarily expensive Cabernet, and not many people question your previous history of where you got that $1 billion. Which is also to say, for us as Napa Valley cab drinkers, there's a phenomena, and it's strong here, of keeping up with the Joneses. Well, if that property has their first initial release price at $125, why is my Napa Cabernet not selling at $125? I see this in the valley quite a lot, actually. It is another reason that the valley is very expensive. But I think one way to work through this is to think about the past and what's gone on. Of course, also think about all of the information we learned in the first flight. But I think it's the past that gives us a clue to the valley and also thinks about where it's going. The other amazing thing is, of course, this is California, and it's California winemaking, and it has an extraordinarily interesting past. So, again, I don't like to leave people not drinking, so we're going to start with this first wine, and it's called Beaulieu, and it's the Rutherford Cabernet. We have two, and you can choose to have two if you want, or you can just do one. You can do the Rutherford Cabernet, or you can choose the George de la Tour Private Reserve. And we'll talk about both of these as we go on. Here, though, I think it's fascinating because we're going to meet a young immigrant, and that young immigrant is a man named George de la Tour. George de la Tour was French, and he was trained as a chemist at a Jesuit school in France, near Périgord, the place famous for black truffles. When phylloxera struck his family vineyards, there was not much left for him to do there, and replanting without knowing why was difficult. And so he made the amazing choice as a young man to immigrate, and not only just immigrate to America, but immigrate to San Francisco. Now, San Francisco had been a state for over 2 decades when this happened, but you can imagine it was still rather the Wild West. But one of the things that was going on in San Francisco at this time was France and French were the rage. And all the way from the language, the culture, but also French goods. French wine, French silk dresses, French perfume, everything French was the rage in San Francisco when he immigrated. Now, he was lucky, but I think he was also incredibly enterprising. He soon took his skill set and started looking for ways to develop it. And what he found was cream of tartar. Now, we don't use it much anymore, but I can remember my grandmother using it in baking, and I'm still out there somewhere. But it was a baking ingredient. Now, those of you who have ever had a white wine, and I'm just going to grab this one at random, this doesn't have it, but those of you who have ever had a white wine that you chill really hard and suddenly you get little crystals at the bottom of the wine, that's actually the formation of tartaric acid. You, of course, can just ingest it. There's no reason not to. It's not going to harm you, and it's just part of the winemaking process. Well, as part of the winemaking process, and we don't necessarily want it in our bottles, but as part of the winemaking process, tartar builds up on oak barrels. George de la Tour had the amazing insight of wineries just scrape that off and throw it away, and it's a pain in the ass for them. What if I go in and I scrape off all the tartar barrels, and they end up just giving it to me for free because it's a waste product to them, and I can go and then turn it into the industry that needs it. And that actually led to his first fortune, was selling cream of tartar. Now, around 1900, George de Latour had married, and he's of course French, and he has memories of having great claret, great wine in his native homeland. And he wants to have the good life in California as well. And so he actually drives over with his young wife, Madame George de Latour, as she was known, and they find a 100-acre property in Rutherford in Napa Valley. They purchase it, and she says it was so extraordinarily beautiful with fruit trees, olive trees. It would have had a little pasture land that she named it A Beautiful View, hence the name Beaulieu, or BV, as it got shortened down to. Now, George was a businessman, and he felt extremely compelled to always, let's keep drinking this wine as I tell this fascinating story here. Now, George was a businessman, and he always felt incredibly compelled to make a profit at his winery. And I can kind of understand the feeling as a young immigrant if you were going to be forced to do it. So he always had a tension between his winery of trying to make great wine like he remembered in France, but also trying to make a profit. And really, at this point in time, it was the profit side, and the profit side driven by bulk wine production, that probably skewed BV the way it was going to skew. So he started buying lots of bulk juice, as it's called, manufacturing it, and sending it out. By all accounts, and again, this is pre-World War I winemaking, by all accounts it was a seesaw between something that was okay and something that was somewhat flawed. I haven't tasted any of those bottles, so I don't know. I'm reading that from books. Now, something came along that George got wind of early, and it's, of course, the great American tragedy called Prohibition. George, being French, was always a Catholic, and he had been raised in a Jesuit school. So when he came to San Francisco, he reached out to the Catholic Archdiocese, and he was a faithful Catholic, and he was also a strong donor to the church. That led him to do a couple of things as Prohibition approached. First, he bought enormous quantities of sweet wine, just absolutely volumetric amounts of it. If you look back at the establishment of Prohibition in January of 1919, producers were given 3 months to sell off their stock. So George's first move was to have accumulated an incredible amount of sweet wine, which is what Americans were drinking, and then in 3 months he sold it off. But not only sold it off, he sold it off at exceptionally high prices because he was the only one who had it. This led to his second largest fortune. Once Prohibition hit him full, he used his contacts to actually provide the Catholic Church with all of their sacramental wine. This means that from 1919 to the end of 1933, and actually the date is my birthday, December 5th, when Prohibition gets repealed. It's a great day to drink wine. On that, for 2 reasons. That means that he had one of the few large functioning wineries in all of California based in Napa Valley. So by 1933, he was really poised to take advantage of the newfound reborn market. But he had one problem. His wine was still of lackluster quality, and he didn't know how to take it to the level of those great French clarets that he really desired. Now at this point, we need to leave George de Latour just momentarily, and I know this is going to be a real side trip, so feel free to keep drinking while I go on, but I think it's a great story and profound for the influence of Napa Valley. At this point, we actually have to go and we need to meet a Russian immigrant named Andrei Telechev. Andrei Telechev was born in White Russia, so Ukraine, Russia, just after the Communist Revolution to minor petty bureaucrats, is my understanding. Actually, he was born before because he served in the White Russian Army. So he was born at the turn of the century. Serving in the White Russian Army in Crimea, he was actually part of a bombardment where he got shot and then crawled into a hole and was left for dead. Andre apparently was always a very short man and of limited stature, and it wasn't until 2 days later, when they were trying to uncover casualties to bury him, that another army officer had found Andre. Now, during this time, his family had been informed that he was dead, and they held a full ceremony for him. So I can't imagine what it was like when he came back, but it's amazing that he survived. He eventually made his way to Yugoslavia. I'm not making this up. Maybe I am, actually. He eventually made his way to what would become Yugoslavia, and then eventually to Paris, and studied under Louis Pasteur in a couple of different programs, including immunology, but also, of course, microbiology. Now, here is Andre in 1936 in Paris. And actually, Georges de Latour is decided that he needs to take his winery up to a new level, and the way to do that is to hire a French winemaker. And so he goes to Paris to try and hire a French winemaker. And what ends up happening is he gets recommended Andrei Telechev, as he said it, the small Russian with the unpronounceable name. These two actually, for some reason, form a friendship with one another, and Georges de Latour decides that Andre should be the winemaker that comes over. Now, I can't imagine the extraordinary story of Andre from the Ukraine over all the way to this beautiful vineyard in Napa Valley, but that is the story that takes place. And Andre arrives at BV, the beautiful place that they have now turned into a mansion with a side house for Andre, his wife, and his son in late 1938, after a 5-week train ride and a 5-week ocean ride across the Pacific. Andre and Georges de Latour start tasting wine together, and Andre notes that the conditions at BV at that time are horrible. They haven't been updated in years because the mission has always been to produce wine that will make money. George wanted to do something different, though, so he provided Andre with a lab. He also showed Andre one of his most special wines, something that he thought was very different. George had for years been bringing over vines from France, and specifically the area of Bordeaux, and planting them in Rutherford. This had taken hold, and George had really thought that the 1936 straight Cabernet from Rutherford was one of the best wines that he had ever made, or maybe even that he had ever tasted. He tasted it with Andre, and Andre thought it was amazing as well. That brings us to our glass, finally. We have two things going on here, and it depends on how much you want to spend, what kind of evening you're having. I don't want to dictate to you. We have BV Rutherford. And BV Rutherford is, of course, we don't have the 1936, but we've got BV Rutherford, and that is actually BV and its vineyards in Rutherford. The 1936 became such a profound wine to Andre and Georges de Latour that they loved tasting it together, and they wanted to keep it separate. Now, unfortunately, soon after tasting it, Georges de Latour passed away. Madame de Latour also knew of the 36 Cabernet, and she was the one, along with Andre, who said we should bottle it and we should name it Georges de Latour Private Reserve. This actually gives birth to one of Napa's longest-standing elite wines. It's had its ups and downs over the years, which we'll talk about in a second, but it is the longest-standing, one of the longest-standing of Napa's most elites. So again, coming back, you have two options, the Rutherford bottling, and then also you can have the Georges de Latour from the current vintage. Now, what makes this wine so special? I think it's beautiful on the nose. It has the same soil type as the Honig, so you still get lots of black fruit, but there's also tons of complexity with a real nice red cherry fruit character to it. Andre never got to buy new oak barrels, and the winemaker of BV told me that he once worked with Andre, and Andre said, why don't you please buy new oak barrels at this point, because I never got to have them. So it's got a judicious amount of new oak on it as well, but I think it's in harmony and gives you the full and complete picture of Napa Cabernet. and I think gorgeous stuff. Now I think a couple of questions may have arisen in your mind. One is, well, I used to hit this more, but it's certainly one I hit. One is, I don't associate BV with wines that cost $40, let alone $150. The other question is, what really is the difference between these two bottles of wine? And I think they're both worthy of answering. Now, BV had a long history to it, but eventually, I think the easiest way is to say that the family was not able to hold it together, either due to lack of interest on it, age, other factors. So by 1969, BV gets sold off, and it goes through a series of ownerships, including Nabisco, including Ebeline. At one point, it ends up with Diageo, and right now it's with a group called Treasury. Now, throughout that history, of course, some people from 69 to 2015, some people have tried to capitalize on the name, and also maybe a little bit of the historical legacy of sometimes making bulk wine. So if you know BV for making inexpensive wine, that's the reason why. As the years from 69 to 2014-15 maybe were not the kindest to this winery. I can tell you now, though, that the two differences between these wines are really the fruit quality going into it and also the ability to use very expensive resources in the winery to produce what that wine is. The fruit quality we had a little bit of a discussion about before, but what I can tell you here is that Treasury, who owns BV, owns a lot of land within Napa Valley. And they have teams that work that land, and those teams will actually go out and grade the fruit from 1 to 5, 1 being the top and 5 being the bottom. Now, of course, it's all really good fruit. It's making great wine, but the ones that are the fruit that's graded number 1 is just the absolute best, the absolute perfect ripeness, if you will. The very special fruit from vineyards like George de la Tour 1, 2, or 3 that were planted in the Rutherford Bench and produced some of the valley's most expensive fruit. So the separation between these two is that the George de la Tour gets all of that top fruit, or excuse me, is exclusively made from that top fruit, whereas the BV gets other fruit to it. I don't mean to say that the Rutherford BV is a bad wine, it's just not of the same quality. Then in the winery, a winemaker who makes these two wines is he has a program where this one, the top one, gets the most expensive, most lavish French oak that it can. It gets the chance to sit as long as he thinks it needs it to sit. Whereas the Rutherford gets a less luxurious experience, if you will. Now again, I should point out that we're in the realm of the height of luxury in Napa Cab, so neither of these wines is going to disappoint at all, but there's just a question and a separation between them. I'll end this final chapter, I'll end this final glass, I'm still only on the first one, about BV by hanging on to that man named Andrei Telechev. And if there was one man whose name I'd love to have you learn about Napa Valley, it's him. And the reason is that he, if you count the 36 vintage as one of his wines, I think he continued to make wine in Napa Valley until 1995. And he didn't just make it at BV. I think by 1941, he had set up his own independent consulting laboratory. So any winemaker within Napa Valley, particularly with the rebirth that started with Robert Mondavi in '68, knew of Andrei Telechev, and he was a fond man to go consulting on wines, and he was always, to my understanding, open and ready to help anyone in the valley make their wines. I think if you talk to any winemaker within the valley, Andrei Telechev has had a seminal impact on all of the wines that you taste, even if he passed away about a decade ago. Okay, long story, but I think one that gives you the heart of Napa Valley. I'd like to give you another one. Should we cut the time, or is it okay?
No, we're at 19.
Okay, I'll give it another one. Excuse those watching at home as we taste and think about timing. The next one I want to give you is Lale Vineyards, right here. And I would guess that Lale is not well known to most of you, but is an exceptionally important marker on Napa Valley and who Robin Lail is, and particularly who her descendants are. Now here, we're actually going to start our story in 1868. And we're gonna start our story with a Finnish sea captain, if you would believe that of all things. And this Finnish sea captain was named Nibelung. And he has the amazing expertise of he became a Finnish sea captain for the Russian Tsar Nicholas I by the time he was 22. And he was commissioned to go and trade in Alaska and on down California. He must have been a very brave man because he makes the passage and then he spends 3 years in Alaska on a ship trading for furs. By the time he comes down to San Francisco, he actually has amassed so many furs that he can sell them, and he develops his first fortune. Again, I'm not joking, this man exists, Gustav Nibelung. Now, Gustav Nibelung then married a woman of German descent from Healdsburg up in Sonoma, and he grew to the point that he wanted a sailing life again. He didn't want to settle down. First of the things he did is he formed a corporation with some of his old Alaskan buddies. And to my understanding, he approached the US government for exclusive whaling rights up in a particular group of islands. And he got it. He paid $12 million for it, but he got it. For the next 20 years, he went whaling, and he amassed a huge fortune off of whaling. Now, my understanding is his dream was to create essentially a mansion on a boat and just sail the world for the rest of his life. His bride didn't necessarily like that idea. Where they ended up, German fortuitude took over, they actually ended up in Napa Valley. There in Napa Valley, he went and he noticed something, that was going on, which was very limited amounts of viticulture. Now this is in 1881. He actually ends up at a place that at the time was a sanitarium owned by a doctor that had some vines on it. He looked at it and he bought the sanitarium. And with that, he ends up with some vines. Now, this sanitarium he takes the name of, and the doctor happened to be of Scottish descent, and so the name is Inglenook. And to my understanding, Inglenook means a chair that you would set by a hearth to be warm. So the Scottish doctor gives the name of this place Inglenook, and Nibelung chooses to keep it. Now, Nibelung had some similar goals of he wanted to make the best possible wine he could, and he seems like a man who was very driven by purpose to try and do that. So he starts importing French varieties into Napa in order to make the greatest possible wine he can. And indeed, from my understanding, he actually succeeds. By 1881 is the founding, 1882 he has his first vintage, but by the late 1890s, his wines, Nibelung wines, Inglenook wines I should say, are being shown at the Paris Exposition and winning top prizes. Okay, there are a couple of names there that you might recognize. Nibelung, Inglenook, and we're gonna have to sort out what happens to them as they go along. And we have to get down to this next wine, Robin Lail. But just so take a taste of Lail as I tell you this wild story. Inglenook as a winery stops at Prohibition. They don't have the same history as George de la Tour and BV. But when Prohibition is let off in 1933, they start once again. And it's with Nibelung's, I think, great niece. Now, I'm just gonna go a little bit faster because I wanna get to the point of that glass. By the 1960s, we're going to end up with a descendant, and I think he's the great nephew of Gustav Nibelung, named John Daniels. Now, John Daniels has inherited Inglenook, and at this point, Inglenook is, you might say, the shining star of Napa Valley. It had won prestigious awards in the past century in Paris, in France, against French wines, and he was producing some of the best wine in Napa Valley at this point, both honored internationally and locally with fairly high prices. I I think his 64 debuted at $2 a bottle for his Napa Cabernet. But there was something afoot with John Daniels and Inglenook, and that something afoot was that the massive fortune that Gustav Niebaum had developed was now fading. And also, John Daniels did not want to lose the quality of any of his wines. He felt like anything that had the Inglenook name needed to be of the most exceptional quality. Well, eventually this is going to cause a problem for him because as the money runs out, but the wines aren't making enough, something's got to give. Now, unfortunately, that something that has got to give means that the winery gets sold in 1969. And it goes through the same succession of odd owners that we saw with BV. It actually, in a real wild chase, gets purchased by Ebeline, and then it gets to Nabisco for a little bit. Coca-Cola gets its action in there for, I think, just a tiny moment. And then it shifts over to someone else. And during that time, what I have clients of an age when they were drinking wine in the 1970s. During that time, Inglenook actually becomes a jug brand. So many of the people who know the gallon jugs, I think Gallo still makes them, know Inglenook as a jug brand. We have a couple of things, so let's just trace the property for a moment. The property itself of Inglenook, and you can visit it, it's this famous big chateau at this point, gets sold in 1975. And it gets sold to a famous film director, and that is Francis Ford Coppola. Now, he's in the midst of making Apocalypse Now, and so he immediately has to leverage it out to try and finish Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now wasn't the success that he hoped for, and so he has to start doing all kinds of other activities to make up for that. One of the things that I think he does, although I'm probably going to get sued for saying this, is he starts making wine. And that, if you know the Niebaum Coppola label, is the reason. He owns the property that Gustav Niebaum made, and his name is Coppola. So I think it was an homage to that property. Now, it's funny, and I think probably frustrating for him, of that he owns this famous property that was considered the best, but he's having to rename it. It's not until 2011, for a sum that's never been disclosed, but he said it was worth more than the entire property that he bought, he actually purchased the Inglenook name back. So I think with the 13 vintage, he starts making Inglenook wines again that are not jug wines, they're based on the property itself. So one way you can go is to taste some of those Inglenook wines or taste some Francis Ford Coppola wines, as he still owns the winery. But I'd like to follow the family a little bit here. John Daniels had 2 daughters. And when he passed the winery on, I think it really crushed him. When he sold the winery, it really crushed him. Luckily, one of his daughters, Robin Lale, was an extraordinary woman who also has a piece of Napa history that gets overlooked. She, with her inheritance, got just a minor part of it, is my understanding. But she had the amazing fortune of meeting up with what would become the superstars of Napa's wine industry. She met up with Bob Harlan, who makes Napa's most expensive wine at this point. She met up with the owners of Maryvale and founded it. The big auction in Napa Valley that I think is one of the largest charity auctions in the world, she was one of the founders of. She also met up with a Frenchman named Christian Moex and founded a famous estate that we're about to taste called Dominus. But finally, her family record comes down to this, and this was the long point of my story, is that this is Robin Lale's family making wine in Napa Valley under their own names. So a very long story, but I think it gives you a clue to the shifts of what's going on in Napa Valley and what has gone on. And when I've met her, I just got the strong sensation that understanding 6 generations of Napa Valley wine actually meant something, and you could kind of hold it in the glass and think about what she's been through and what all of the valley has been through. So it was a long story, but I wanted to pour you this one to have you take a taste of and see. I think her daughters have taken over at this point. So again, 6 generations of Daniels, one of the longest families making wine in Napa Valley. The final wine in this flight In Robin Daniels working through the ending of Inglenook and finding her own path, she met up with a Frenchman named Christian Moix. And Christian Moix at the time made Petrus and still makes Lafleur Petrus, and I think owns all of Pomerol. So he's a rather famous winemaker, and this was in the early 80s. One of the direct pieces of inheritance, probably I think the only direct piece of inheritance she got from the dissolution of Inglenook, was a vineyard called Napa Nook. So a very specific place for her, and together they formed a partnership. Now, Napa Nook is down here in Yountville, another area right there, and I think, to my understanding, Christian Moix absolutely fell in love with it. I wanted to bring this wine to your attention, both because of the final historical hook that we have, but also because it smells different than the others, and I think it tastes different. Leads us into or gives us a connection to our next flight, if you will, which is that winemaking styles can change in Napa Valley. So here, of course, if we reflect back on our first flight, we've got a much cooler climate, and I think it shows in the red fruit character of this wine, but also I think it's pretty, again, green notes to it, touch of gravel, a touch of pencil lead, if you will. And that, I think, would also reflect Christian's traditions of being a French winemaker now operating in Napa Valley. And it's in the next flight that we'll give a great look to what makes a wine for a winemaker and how we can interpret these things, but also the historical traditions of what a winemaker does.